introduce each panelist for a 5-minute summary. So panelist number one, Misa Nguyen, is a PhD student in ancient history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on Mediterranean pregnancy from the 1st century to late antiquity, drawing on intersections with death and monstrosity studies. She seeks to challenge the idea of pregnancy as a timeless, historically neutral phenomenon that has gone unchanged for 2,000 years. Misa, I turn the Zoom over to you.
Thank you so much, Janice. Okay, so my talk focused on the British-Italian production that came out earlier this year, Domina, which focuses on Livia Drusilla and the rise of the Principate. My talk focuses specifically on the narrative and visual cues that Domina used to create this idea that pregnancy, pregnant bodies, pregnant knowledge was at the center of imperial power within this context of the early Principate, and the ways in which that imperial power rested on the laboring bodies of its women. I argue that this reading is radical for not just ancient Mediterranean dramas, but for much television drama in general, which has rested on this dynamic of violence and elision of most of its pregnancies. I do conclude my talk by arguing that this privileging of pregnancy in Domina extends only to the white pregnant body, and conclude my talk by looking at the ways in which the show both marginalizes and exploits the Black maternal experience through the eyes of the free woman Antiquity. So, much less than 5 minutes, but still a summary.
Well, that's very good. Thank you so much for that quick summary. And we will now move on to our next panelist to summarize their presentation. And our next panelist is M. Roalsvig. And from their own bio on site, M. Roalsvig graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a BA in English Literature and an MA in Classics. Their academic pursuits lie in the reception of classical literature in late medieval and early Italian Renaissance, as well as reinterpretations and adaptations of classical mythology in modern queer literature and theater. They are drawn to representations of subordinate characters, how the thoughts and actions of female and transgender characters are described by the inherent biases of their male authors. They hope to help challenge the male elitist rhetoric in classical scholarship by continuing work to diversify the depth and spectrum of gender studies in ancient literature during their graduate studies. And turn Zoom over to you.
Thank you. Okay, my talk focuses specifically on two French films from 2016 and 2019, who reinterpret the fatal gaze from the Orpheus and Eurydice myth and reconfigure it through nonverbal communication and eye contact and body gestures to show consent and desire. So both these movies craft a queer love story out of the tragedy of the classical heterosexual love story. And they reconstruct gender and sexuality for a happy ending. And I wanted to briefly share my slides so you can see just how much of this film is focused on eye contact. So I included some screenshots. Here we see them looking at each other at the end. We see them intensely looking at each other through intercourse at a sex club, looking at each other through the entire length of the train ride that they're riding on, just walking around the city, looking at each other, the fatal Orpheus moment. And then again, in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, we have just endless, intimate eye contact where they paint each other, they sleep next to each other, they barely kiss, but you can still feel the true emotion going on in these bodies and eye contact. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And our third panelist of the day is Sarah Mark from the University of British Columbia. And I believe I left out the places where our other panelists hail from. Forgive me. I believe that both of our previous panelists are from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Sarah Mark hails from the University of British Columbia. And Sarah is a master's student in classics at the University of British Columbia. She holds a master's degree in Roman myth and history from the University of Exeter. Her earlier work has explored myths surrounding the origins of famous Roman cognomina. Her current research focuses on accounts of hostages and prisoners of war during the Second Punic War and the changing role played by patronage in the mid-Republican army. She enjoys video games, particularly those set in the ancient world. So Sarah, I turn Zoom over to you.
Thank you. So there we go. Thank you. My talk is about the video game Hades, released by Supergiant Games in 2019. It's a game set in the Greek underworld, and you play as Zagreus, a character that is found in the Dionysiac traditions, but is rather obscure to the average gamer compared to a character like an Olympian god. In this case, Supergiant Games has made Zagreus into the son of Hades and Persephone. We follow Zagreus as he learns that the goddess Nyx, who raised him, is not in fact his birth mother, but he has to solve then the problem of what happened to the mysterious disappearance of the queen of the underworld, his mother Persephone. The game structures the underworld like a labyrinth in which you move from chamber to chamber through Tartarus, Acheron, Elysium, and so on as you try to fight through the underworld and up to the surface. Because it's what's known as a rogue-style game, you can expect to die and regenerate frequently each time gaining knowledge and skills. But by framing Hades as a maze, I argue that the player solves the game by moving not through space, but through narrative. Over the course of the game, the role of Zagreus and by extension the player shifts, and the new goal becomes not to escape, but rather to shape and improve the underworld. This is done substantially through resolving narrative endings, which allow familiar characters from mythology, including Orpheus and Eurydice, to attain new and happier resolutions to the stories found in canon. Hades relies on a certain shared understanding of mythology among its players. The subversion of familiar myths is most effective when the audience is already somewhat familiar with the canon. So in generating this gaming environment of the underworld, Hades must immerse the player in a familiar classical framework before they can depart from tradition to build a new narrative. Keeping a unifying visual style and consistent dialogue helps to add content to the framework, but the core of the heavy lifting is done by the character of Zagreus himself, how he is integrated into the space and the story of the game. And I would argue that Hades is best read as an original myth that nods at the canon, but uses its medium to deliver a new space and a new story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I am reminded by Dan that there's a playthrough of Hades on Friday afternoon for those of you who would like to attend. Okay, that's great. So now we have our summaries of our three presentations, and hopefully you have had a chance to see the actual presentation. And so I'm going to start things off by asking a question that I think would appeal to all three of our presenters, and just let them take the ball and run with it. And in the meantime, I want to thank everybody for keeping muted. It was something I neglected to ask you to do, and you all did it anyway, so bravo. And so here is my question that I think will help bring all of these presentations together, and or at least acknowledges how all these presentations bring together bring together the idea of the panel, which I remind you is entitled Bodies Transforming Space. So panelists, all of your presentation today look at texts in all their glorious manifestations that don't simply just reflect or amplify traditional classical motifs and themes, but strive to somehow challenge, subvert, expand, and even replace such traditional presentations, applications, and interpretations. It would be great to hear our presenters share their thoughts on this aspect of reception theory. Perhaps M would like to start us off by explaining this one line that appears both in their abstract and their talk. And I quote, "Classical reception begins in a desire for what is absent," unquote. So, Em, if you're up to it, you can start us off, and please, our other presenters, have at it.
Okay, yeah, definitely. So I first came across and developed that idea of reception theory when I read Joshua Billings' Erotics of Reception. So if you're more interested in that, check that article out. But basically, classical reception explains our desire to interact with the past, but to look for things that it may not have offered. What I really like about mythology is that it has universal themes that are still relevant today. It's also generative. It continuously produces more and more stories as much as we interpret and work with it. And it also can be subversive. So we can take the story for what it is and change the meaning behind it. So my work in these two films took the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and presented it from same-sex love. Theo and Hugo are both males, but they don't have the pederastic hierarchy of ancient Greek love. They exist on a level of equality. They're the same age, they're the same social status. They both reconcile and deal with the fact that they are positive for AIDS. Portrait of a Lady on Fire goes one step further and subverts the male gaze with an all-feminine sphere. It's really beautiful. The whole movie is only spoken by women, all 121 minutes of it. So in both these films, we see how modernity wants to adapt mythology in a way that was not possible in the original texts. And then for fun, I also want to talk about how reception itself is like eye contact. It's a dialectical process. So we look back to history to learn things about history, but also to learn things about ourselves. It's a process of giving and receiving data, just like eye contact and Orpheus's gaze itself. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the audience, please put them in the chat, and we will attend to them as they come in. But first, would our other presenters like to talk about that?
Do you want me to go first, Sarah?
Sure.
Okay, so I think the talk issue of domina as subverting or pushing back against historical narratives is an interesting one, and also from a fundamentally different stance than from my two co-presenters, because you are both working with myth. Domino works with history, so we have to work with the historical space of Livia, and also in particular the historical receptions of Livia, which is, of course, the Robert Graves' I, Claudius is Livia as a scheming, emotionless, passionless mastermind. So I think Domina is working against both modern and ancient texts about Livia and about pregnant women in general. Because if you look at the Roman histories or ancient histories, there's this immense gap and absence of the pregnant experience. The main example we have is Nero kicking his pregnant wife to death. And that I can't think of another major pregnant woman we see besides Perpetua 2 centuries later. So Domina is working within this gap, so not pushing back against it, just entering the gap as an act of resistance and subversion in itself. And like while working against like texts like I Claudius or Rome HBO or Spartacus, which I allude to in my talk, that's the much more direct pushback against our pregnant characters' plot mechanics. Is pregnancy a plot mechanic, or is pregnancy a plot in itself? I think that Domina does a great work of subverting that by saying that yes, pregnancy is a plot in itself, and it's also a plot that's not just relegated to women. Like in the show, both men and women are deeply, intimately interested in both the political and applications of imperial pregnancies.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, your shot.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm interested in just coming back to what Em was saying about happy endings, because that's certainly something that my paper was dealing with. And classical reception theory tells us a lot about what a modern audience might think is missing from the canon, or what a new interpretation might bring in order to give kind of a new, not just a retelling, but a new layer of understanding and satisfaction to the audience. And I think that anyone who's looked at classical reception is going to be familiar with the idea for endings that kind of move beyond endings that we've seen before. So in the sense of a bestseller like Song of Achilles does this, various other trends. The musical Hadestown does this kind of thing as well. I particularly like the idea of the underworld as a place of fluidity and a place where new endings can be written. And that's something that the ancient authors themselves have played around with a bit. And certainly in the case of authors like Virgil, you get them a real sort of rewriting and reintegration of older stories into a modern context, viewed through this opening into the underworld. But what we see in some of these modern adaptations is this idea that there's the immersion of a viewer as well, or a player. Video games, for instance, are the most immersive of technologies. So you really do get a narrative that opens up that the player themselves can choose and change as you move along. And that brings a whole new dimension to these writings of myth.
Well said, all of you. Thank you very much. And thank you for writing in your abstract that line that grabbed all of us on this panel, grabbed our attention. Some questions have been coming in, and that's great, and I'd like to share them. One question, the first question that came in, actually it presents the same question that I had when I watched Misa's presentation, and I'm going to put it in my words, and then I'm going to invite the person who made this, who posed this question, to actually unmute and present her own version of the same question. When I watched Domina, when I watched Misa's presentation about Domina, I couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't, if the pregnancy and trials and birth and labor of Livia wasn't foregrounded to point to the importance that it was an imperial relationship, that the men were interested in what was going on because it affected them in terms of power. And of course, Domina, the name of it suggests that it's about power dynamics, and that the fact that the midwife and Antiquity was a marginalized woman of color was sort of and it emphasized the class difference because who cares about regular women and their problems? I mean, if you're not birthing an heir to the imperial throne, doesn't matter. So anyway, Kirsten Day asked a similar question, I think. And Kirsten, would you care to articulate your own question in your own way?
Yeah. Thank you, Janice. And thank you for your paper, Misa, and everyone else. I was troubled when I watched Domina. It's been quite a while since I watched it, at the casting of, when I saw the commercials or the trailers, I thought it was great for there to be, Black actress foregrounded, but then it was quickly became clear that she was at least initially a slave character. And this kind of reinforces the idea that we have, at least in America, this association between Black and slave, or enslaved person and Black people, put it the other way. So the fact that the most prominent slave character and the most prominent Black character in this series were the same person was a little troubling to me. I wish that there had been a little bit more diversity in the cast. And then also that there was another white slave character that came a little bit later, but she wasn't nearly as prominent. So that kind of connection, I think, is problematic, at least in a US context and probably elsewhere as well. But the de-emphasizing of her pregnancy seems like related to that in the ways Janice said, because it's politically not as important because she's not a member of the imperial family, but it's all related. So these problems are intertwined in a lot of ways, it seemed to me.
So one, absolutely yes. Like I had the same reaction. I had a slightly different reaction watching the trailer. Gonna watch the trailer, expected this is going to be terrible. I'll watch it just for fun. And it turned into a great show. And I had different set of problems I engaged with after watching the show, but the show itself was great fun. And yes, like the main issue that was driving my discontent was the treatment of race on the show. So like 2 of the 3 Black characters are former enslaved people, and like the white slaves get a much less prominent role, as you do correctly point out. And I think the issue with my issue with Domina's framing of Antigone is there are 2 terms I want to go first to explain it. So like the terms Watsonian and Doylist, right? These are commonly used in like analyses of media. Watsonian perspective is based on like the character of Watson from Sherlock Holmes, where he is like in-universe explanations for the way things play out. Doylist explanations come from Doyle, the creator of the Holmes novels and short stories, talk about reasons outside the universe, but based on the author's own worldview for why these same actions play out. And I'm bringing it up Watson and Doyle because I think these are the 2 main engines for why I'm so troubled by Antigone's treatment on the show. So first of all, yes, like not just as a Black woman, but as a freed woman and someone who's not in the imperial family, it makes sense that the characters on the show would marginalize her and push her aside. What troubles me is with the way that the showrunners themselves and the script itself also marginalizes Antigone, because I do believe there is a way that we could have shown the characters the white imperial characters not caring about Antigone while still treating her with the respect and compassion that she deserves. So for example, we could have seen that Livia, who is prone to have like a very narrow focus on her family's safety, it makes sense that Livia brushes off Antigone's pregnancies when they're not relevant to her assassination plots. It's not necessary, based on the role of the show, for Antigone's miscarriage to be revealed in a single line between her husband and Livia, centering Livia's reaction to her miscarriage, and for Antigone to spend the entire episode not talking to anyone about her miscarriage, not talking to anyone about her grief or recovery, not being treated with a curry by either her husband or other freed people around her. So both the characters marginalize her, yes, but the show also deliberately and perhaps unconsciously also served to push her to the margins of other white pregnancies. I hope that does like answer the question a bit. And then the digression was a bit unexpected to Watson and Doyle.
Yeah, Kirsten, are you satisfied? I am.
Yes, that was great. And I really enjoyed the paper. I think you're exactly right. And your paper was spot on as well, but thank you for fleshing that out. That was That was informative. Thank you.
All right, and a follow-up question to this, and I believe me, I am very much going to pay attention to giving all of our panelists enough time to answer all the questions that are being directed at them. But I just want to ask the follow-up question that's posed by one of our participants. Let's see, Anish Strong asks about connections or reflections perhaps of Hulu's production of The Handmaid's Tale and the depiction of pregnancy and childbirth. And she writes, in particular, that's a show that has also been frequently, and I think correctly, accused of foregrounding the pain and suffering of well-educated white women characters rather than the women of color. Or low SES, social status, social
economic status. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Anise. All right. Did I do justice to your question there? Is that enough for Misa to respond quickly to this?
Yeah, I think there's basically to what extent is this part of a broader trend that while we're getting women's narratives and we're getting focus on women's issues like pregnancy and childbirth, the focus is still only on a certain kind of woman.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so I actually haven't watched Handmaid's Tale in part because of the accusations of trauma porn around it, so it's not something I'm interested in tracking as much. But I do very much agree that like this is part of a larger trend where like white women on television are often like this canary in the coal mine where like if any feminist treatment is going on about pregnancy or motherhood or class issues or anything, it usually focuses on white, wealthy, able-bodied women first and foremost. So the fact that we're talking about pregnancy in a realistic, nuanced manner on a show about ancient Rome, home of the patriarchy, home of the paterfamilias is a great thing, I think. It is an expansion over like, previous shows we've seen that all focused on white pregnant women in very like distasteful ways. But there's still, I think, a lot to then be done just with foregrounding pregnancies that are not white, pregnancies that are not able-bodied, and so forth. But it's one step forward for now.
A little bit move, but not enough.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to asking Sarah a couple of questions. One was presented by Alexander Vonderwaller, and it reads, viewing Hades as its own original myth, which I definitely think we can and even must do. Do you think the randomized or procedural nature of its story adds to its mythical qualities in that there's instantly multiple versions of the same story? Or how do you relate the actual gameplay to the narrative as myth?
That I really like. So there is a quote from Greg Kasavin, the creative director of Hades, who says that it's an infinitely replayable game. So ideally it should have infinite content. And it is a game that received a great deal of accolades, as I'm sure you know, when it first came out, for having its dialogue among all kinds of minor characters be extremely rich, extremely varied. There are not infinite, but a huge number of different paths you can take. And this relates to the construction of the space of Hades as well. The fact that it's a labyrinth, that it was originally designed as a game called Minos, where you would be literally fighting your way through the labyrinth at Knossos, which would have been interesting, but that's a different issue. In terms of viewing it as myth, yeah, I think it's an immersive myth. It's one where you write your own endings. What they've done is kind of set up the thread for you to carry through the labyrinth, if you like, and then you decide which paths you take. And the very doors that you take to move from level to level are hidden in terms of what you're going to get when you move through. So you never know which space you're going to find yourself in. In terms of concluding that, as in terms of reaching a narrative conclusion, there is an end to the game, but it is only sort of one real ending in which you can try and reunite Hades and Persephone. But then if you do, you know, spoilers, but the game finds ways to keep you coming back and to keep playing. So the fact that it's immersive, it really shows what a game can do, as opposed to a more one-way medium of entertainment, that what the player brings is going to change the path. And that ends with various romantic options that you can choose to pursue or not to pursue. It ends with, you know, the side quests that you can choose to reunite Achilles and Patroclus or not. And it becomes its own original myth because of what the player brings to it, I would say.
Well, that's a great segue. That offers me a great segue into a follow-up question for you, Sarah. And it comes from your fellow panelist, M. And I should let M present this herself, but I just love the way you wrote it. Can I read what you wrote?
Yeah, you can read it. Go ahead.
It says, in your talk, you mentioned the idea of liminal spaces as representing the labyrinthine underworld as a space for tests and change. Zagreus definitely changes as he gains power, but do the game players also change throughout the narrative process? Additionally, Dionysus is a very liminal god, gender fluid, born from a mortal shapeshifter. Does Zagreus, because of his conflation with Dionysus in the Orphic myths, exhibit liminality through his own identity?
Oh, I love that.
Me too.
Thank you. That's a really great question. Yeah. Yes, effectively. The player, as to whether or not the player changes, I mean, that's, I think, you know, only in the sense that your knowledge, you're gaining knowledge of the encounters. If you're not familiar with the myths or how these characters are represented and so on, you're certainly gaining that. You can gain new skills, but it's Zagreus, I think, where the majority of the change occurs. And but it's Zagreus and Hades, both as the father and as the space, where I think you get the most change. And this is one of the things that you're encouraged to do is make changes to the environment in terms of, I mean, you can smash and ruin things, yes, but you also have a sort of a home in Hades where the god Hades has his court, but you can make all kinds of alterations to it, even to your own bedroom. You know, you can decorate Zagreus's own space. You can pet Cerberus and give him doggy toys. But it's so you're in control of the space to a certain extent, and you're choosing how and whether to alter it. But it's the relationship between Zagreus and Hades where the biggest change makes place, and that's kind of the heart of the game. That while Zagreus is searching for a way to escape, and later he's searching for his mother Persephone, he's, without really knowing it, what he's searching for is a better relationship with his own father, with Hades, who in the game is a very stern but distant bureaucrat. And eventually they do start to kind of warm up to each other, and the prize at the end of the game is essentially a fully functioning family unit. Zagreus will discover that he cannot escape the underworld. This is a space of testing that he has to keep being tested in. He actually cannot survive outside it on the surface, but what he can do is improve his environment by improving the relationships with his family and with the other characters he meets.
Thank you so much. Thanks to M for their question and to Sarah for her answer. I'm not a big video game player lately, but I'm interested. I really want to try this. We have we've had a nice conversation about two of our three presentations, and now I'd like to turn to the third. And I think a number of people have shown some interest in in your ideas, or your drawing on the works of Joshua Billings and his Erotics of Perception. You mentioned that in your own summary, and also in your presentation, you talked about Sciamma, the filmmaker, Sciamma. Yeah. Let's see, I took some notes about the cinematic language of the female gaze used to mystify the experience of falling in love to capture the, quote, eroticism of consent, unquote. And I wondered if you could address for us the idea of subverting that male gaze and subverting the dynamic that goes along with it, and how, and if we see it in literature as well as film. I'd be curious about that.
Okay, yeah. So to start off, the male gaze is something that has existed for centuries, but it was analyzed in cinema by Laura Mulvey in 1975. So that's where I started with this. And it's the idea that the male gaze objectifies women. It treats them as conquests, as objects of desire. Whereas in Sciamma, her name is Celine Sciamma's work, she intentionally subverts this into the female gaze, which is one that focuses on equality and consent. So something that we see in this movie is the two characters are an artist and a muse, but instead of the normal heteronormative idea of the male artist consuming and using the female muse to create his artwork, we see a subversion and inversion of this, where both women become both artist and muse. By the end, not only does the painter Marianne sketch her love in multiple different ways, but she also sketches herself and then gives this to Heloise as a gift, so that when they depart, because this is 17th century France and they can't actually be together, when Heloise departs to marry a rich man, they still have this tangible representation of that female gaze, of looking back and forth and understanding each other.
That's good. And I do recall also you talking about the idea of memory as replacing the reality, right? We have a follow-up question, if you're game, from Roger McFarlane, who asks, or Roger, would you prefer to present this, or may I?
Yeah, I'm going to dive in and ask a different one that I wrote up, just because it pertains exactly to what Em was just talking about. There is a male speaker in the film, and it's in the epilogue at the end, that guy who's selling the painting or buying it or whatever. But there's that intense scene where they're reading Ovid's Metamorphoses, sort of reading the Orpheus myth into the record, and Sophie, the maid in this house, has had recently heterosexual relations, and that's part of the backstory, and her reaction to the reading by Marianne and Eloise is kind of interesting. Do you have any particular insights on that, Em, on Sophie's reaction to the budding relationship that involves a lot of eye contact between Eloise and Marianne?
It's been a while since I actually watched the film, so I think you would have better thoughts on this than I, but I did really like how Sophie showed a different point of view, because she was like, well, why did he leave? You know, he loves her, which is what like most readers see in their first interaction with the myth.
Well, I'm saying thank you very much for pointing out the importance of eye contact, because that puts a lot of extra vocabulary or meaning into that scene. What's going on with the eye contact between the two principal characters in the house. So
Gotcha.
thank you.
Okay, yeah. So then Sophie kind of takes the point of view of the audience, who's like a voyeuristic, looking on into this secret, intimate relationship between the women. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you.
Next, and although Roger chose to ask a different question, I still think his original question is worth floating. Basically it's about in Portrait, there's a moment of overt mythological acknowledgement. Sophie joins Marianne, and he's also talking about reading the passage from book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Roger states, Linda Hutchin would call this acknowledgement. Is there a similar moment in Theo and Hugo? Does the film know it's an Orpheus Eurydice adaptation? And I had the same thought when I watched it. It's not an overt homage. So does the film know it's an Orpheus and Eurydice adaptation rather, or is this a reading that you have discerned in it?
Yeah, okay. Let me share my screen real quick, see if I can do that. It is a reading that film critics have done, and I think the director intentionally has done this, but I don't think the characters in the movie themselves know. I want to try to find a slide specifically.
And while you're doing that, I'd like to say I'm very interested in this idea of intentionality on the part of the modern author, because I myself have stirred up some hornet's nests by I've gotten in trouble for suggesting that this was done instead of saying, you know, this is what I see. So. Yeah.
So there are a few quotes in the movie that seem to tie like directly back to the myth. Hugo says that the night is meant for women and for gay men, which seems to tie back directly to that scene in Ovid's Metamorphoses 10, where Orpheus, as a singer at this point, is singing of young boys and girls. And then at the very end of the movie, you have this direct quote that's like, if you turn around, it's over, I'm gonna leave. But they subvert it and they're like, no, we're going to go for it together. So I read one article that was an interview with the director, and it was pretty clear that he had read the story. On a side note, I think it's interesting that he only cites Ovid and not Virgil, but that's a later story. But the characters themselves very much are like not within the sphere of myth. They are very focused on modern century France, gay nightclubs, the reality of HIV and AIDS. Yeah.
Well, I think that you should take much credit for observing those details. Well, we still have time. It's 5:18, and if we're satisfied with how it's going, I'd like to return to Sarah for a moment. We did have a question about whether the choice of which deities would be involved would appear in the Hades game. Why some choices were made, if you know, or what do you think?
I think it comes down essentially to gameplay mechanics. There are some gods that it's fairly easy to draw a correlation between their traditional attributes and the kind of assistance they would give you in a game. So Artemis gives you an arrow that never misses, and Athena gives you a a shield, which gives you an aegis of protection and so on. And no, they don't include all of the Olympians. But the thing that I find really interesting is that they focus a lot on the chthonic gods. And you are, as Zagreus, closer in most ways to the chthonic gods than you are to the Olympians, even though the Olympians are technically your blood relations. It's the inhabitants of the underworld, like the Furies, that you end up having relationships with and meeting much more frequently. The Olympians will often say that they're going to help you, but they're in a very distant kind of way. And that's a whole other subject for sort of Greek religion and direct intervention of gods versus deities at more of a remove, and how you might choose to frame that. But yeah, it comes down to gameplay mechanics, I think. And that's something that every developer has to take into account, that essentially, yes, you're trying to tell the myth the way you want to, but first and foremost, it has to be playable. It has to be fun.
Okay, I think the particular curiosity was, why not Apollo? Why not Hephaestus?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have not found that information, but Greg Casavin, the creative director, is going to be on the Twitch stream with Alexander and Kate later. So I may see if I can drop by and ask him then.
And I'm afraid I can't provide the name of the individual who asked that question, because the email or the name, I'm not sure. So Sebastio, could you make yourself known or tell us?
I can. I'm so sorry. I can turn on my camera. The computer would lend me.
Okay, I just wanted to give you credit for that excellent question.
Thank you. My name is Inês Sebastião. It is a Portuguese name, so I understand the struggle. But Agnes or Sebastian, it is okay too.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry that I mangled that. But thank you very much for your question and for your introducing yourself.
Thank you.
So we can maybe, let's see, at the end here, we can turn once again to Misa, and we can end where we began with a question from Meredith Safran, who's curious about how women consider pregnancy and whether it's a vehicle for power and vulnerability amongst themselves. For example, cursing another woman's pregnancy. And Meredith, feel free to elaborate.
No, I'm cool. I'm just, you got the question. So now I want to hear Misa talk about it.
Okay. Yes, I think that is like a great question, for this, because there's a show about women as it claims. Of course, the way women think and talk about pregnancy on the show is like a huge part of it. And I'm really glad you brought this specific example of women cursing each other's pregnancies, because I don't know if you've actually seen the show yourself, but the opening shot of episode 3, when we meet the adult actors of Domina for the first time, is an interplay of Augustus Caesar and Livia having very pregnant sex, where Augustus is naked, Livia is not. Livia happens to be on top. And it's intercut with Scribonia, his ex-wife, cursing Livia's pregnancy at an altar to Proserpina. So this interplay is from the get-go of like, how do women see pregnancy? It's obviously a tool, the center part of their power as wives and matrons, essential to how they can allow to get most of their power in the ruined world. I think it's also really interesting the way Domina then deconstructs this idea, because a lot of the women on the show, particularly the ones in positions of power, are very much interested in pregnancy and childbirth, not so much in motherhood. Like, most of them are terrible mothers, and the show gives them space to be terrible mothers, which I'll call them out. Like, she's a terrible mother, therefore she must be a terrible woman, a terrible person. Like, Octavia, Scribonia, Livia are the 3 main mothers of the show, invested in each other's pregnancies to an incredible amount. but they don't care for their living birthed children in the same way, and they use them very much as more as power tools in their plays against each other, the way they treat their own and each other's pregnancies. So, brief answer to sum up all of that is like, women on the show do treat pregnancy as essentially like a sort of political currency that is no more and also no less than any other kind of stratagem they used against each other and against the men on the show as well.
Okay, thank you so very much. I think that we have covered the waterfront. Does anybody, do any of our panelists have any final comments that you would like to make? Anything you didn't get to say? I know, Sarah, I have a question that was put aside for you earlier that I didn't get a chance to ask yet, so I can ask you that, and we can. This is a good way to sum things up for all of us. Sarah, if you can start by sharing your thoughts about how we do reframe classical stories and spaces for a modern audience, and it would be great if our other presenters could chime in as well.
It's certainly a big topic, and one which is going to have a multitude of answers depending on which medium you're coming at it from and who the intended audience is. I wanted to kind of jump off that to something that occurred to me watching M's presentation, which is on the underworld. We were talking earlier about it as kind of a liminal space, but the idea of the underworld as a place where you can sort of be your best self in terms of the, you know, they have a very, in the first film you mentioned, it's a very, the metaphorical underworld of Paris, and the idea that this is a place of surprising freedom in the middle of a fairly structured and repressive environment. And that, I think, is a fascinating rereading of the classical underworld. And certainly there are other people who have worked more on how shades are presented in ancient Greece and in Virgil and in other classical contexts. But the idea that there is a continuation of the story, I think, is really important in all of these reframings, that it doesn't have to end where we think it does. And that I think applies to domina and historical representations as well, that we can bring new viewpoints, we can use modern entertainment to enjoy a great story, but also to rethink some of these stories that we have been told through history and through myth.
I'm sorry to have launched that at you at the very last moment. I know that you could probably talk for a long time on that topic. Misa and M, I mean, I know it's a huge topic, but
yeah, I have a brief comment. To go more specifically into what, like, my paper. So one really cool thing about Theo at Hugo and Bodies Transforming Space is that they wander around Paris, and every single minute in the film is tied to a minute of the characters. So it's real time, which is really fascinating. The secondary title is Paris 5:59 because it ends at 6 a.m. But they do this really cool thing where they are following each other. They even say, I'm following you at one point. And there's no direction, but there's a lot of movement. So like Sarah was mentioning, the underworld being a cyclical space, I think in general, like, reinterpretations of the myths are a lot more cyclical than reaching an endpoint. Yeah.
thank you. Misa, would you like to have the last word?
In 2 minutes. Okay. I think one comment about domina, very quickly, one that just sprang off of like M's point just now. So I think that like domina reworks these ideas of what is power, what's pregnancy, how do the two react, in a really interesting way, because it takes this idea of like, because right now, like, female-centered media is very good business in media. Like any kind of TV show can build itself as female-centered and expect to have huge numbers of viewers on that. I think that Domina takes a different approach and a better approach of making it genuinely female-centered, but not pushing the onus on its women to be feminist in the way that we often expect modern female heroes to be. They're not empowered so much as already powerful within the stakes of the show and clawing to keep and attain power. So just the way it pushes back against both documents of the ancient world, women have no power, have no voice officially, and ways in which we conceive of powerful, relatable ancient women today are both like very different things. So the actual last word for M's point, well, you just brought up Paris just now. I'm sorry, we're at 2:30. I'll email you afterwards about it, Em. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, if anybody would like to put any more comments in the chat, please do so, and I'll be saving that and sending it off to the panelists. And it's a great sign that we ran out of time, because that means that this is a really dynamic conversation. And thank you all for participating. If we could all thank our presenters with a round of virtual applause, I'd appreciate that. It'd be great. And I would like to point you in the direction of our next panel, which starts at 6 o'clock in Forum B. And it is an interview with the creators of the series Roads to Rome, and with a Q&A session. And I think that on that note, we can tie this up. And I thank everybody, the presenters in particular, for your time and effort. It was well spent.